Thank you everyone for joining. We're going to get started in about 1 minute while we allow other participants to join. If you're just joining us, we're going to get the program started in just a few moments while we allow others to join us. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Nance, and I'm a member of the Central Committee of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm speaking to you today from Los Angeles, and I'll be chairing today's event. We're going to begin our program in just a moment, but before we do, I'd like to ask everyone watching right now to share the live stream on your own social media pages to help our message reach a larger audience. Thank you. This week, a video recounting the final moments of Ahmaud Arbery, a Black man who was violently killed while jogging in Georgia, has sparked outrage since its release. The video shows a white man who happens to be a former police officer and his son attack and fatally shoot Ahmaud with a shotgun after claiming he was the suspect of a burglary. This tragic event eerily resembles the violence carried out by the Klan and highlights the pervasive racism that continues to plague people of color today in the South and across the country. The PSL denounces the white supremacist violence of the man that took the life of Ahmaud and the failure of the justice system to arrest his murderers. We demand the men responsible be charged and jailed, justice for Ahmaud Arbery, his family, and all victims of racist terror. I want to express our solidarity with all of the teachers, parents, students who are dealing with the closure of schools across the country and all of the challenges that come with it, including distance learning. Monday, May 4th, marked the beginning of Teacher Appreciation Week. Today's event is appropriately titled The Fight for Public Education and the New Era of Class Struggle. First, we'll hear from a panel of PSL members who are teachers and labor organizers in the struggle to defend public education. Then we'll highlight the PSL's newly launched Reds and Eds initiative, followed by an analysis of the overarching struggle for class unity, the coming struggle, and what it looks like. Lastly, we'll close our program with a Q&A featuring some of our panelists. As unemployment soars and an economic recession looms, the ruling class will use the COVID-19 crisis as an excuse to escalate attacks on public education and teachers' unions. In the midst of the pandemic, there have already been announcements announcing school closures and budget cuts. But teachers' unions and communities can fight back. The fight to defend public education is an immediate point of struggle in the United States. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Maura, a high school teacher in Denver, Colorado, and main organizer of the strike led by Denver Classroom Teachers Association in 2019. Maura is an activist with the PSL there. Welcome, Maura.
Thank you, comrade. Happy to be here today. My name is Maura Casados Cassidy. I'm an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, a high school teacher, and a union activist in Denver, Colorado. Public education in the United States has been under attack for decades. And during the last economic recession, budget deficits were used to justify devastating cuts to public education across the country. In Colorado, the majority of schools switched to a 4-day school week. In Denver, half of teachers were driven to quit within their first 5 years, resulting in an extreme turnover rate. Of course, teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions, and the cuts hit working class and oppressed students the hardest. The policies that created these conditions were promoted by Democrats and Republicans alike. Denver, a city controlled by Democrats, pushed to privatize public education and made students into guinea pigs for anti-union privatization reform. This approach, championed by the neoliberal dream team of the Obama administration, the Gates Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation, tore apart community schools and teachers' unions in favor of charter schools and innovation schools. Many schools in Denver closed, and students were forced to enroll in new privately run experimental schools, with multiple charters co-located in the same school building where a traditional neighborhood school had once been. Patterns of racial segregation across the city were exacerbated. In many of these schools, teachers weren't represented by a union. In less than a decade, Denver went from having 17 comprehensive neighborhood high schools with orchestras and football teams and career teachers to having only 3. The district's administrative costs ballooned as teaching salaries stagnated and school funding decreased. When I began teaching in the fall of 2017, my union, the Denver Classroom Teachers Association, was in the middle of negotiations with the district over our master contract. My coworkers and I sat in the negotiations held in middle school gyms until late at night, watching as our union's negotiators accepted concession after concession. After a week of feeble back and forth, we were still facing huge cuts, huge class sizes, astronomical insurance premiums, and draconian performance rankings based on high-stakes testing. When the tentative agreement was passed across the table for our review, a spontaneous chant of "strike, strike, strike" broke out, but then died, going nowhere. We had union representation, which of course is much better than no union at all, but we had no rank and file organization. We were ineffective against the army of lawyers, lobbyists, and accountants paid for and deployed against us by the school district. But Denver was not alone in this struggle. The attacks on public education were playing out across the country, with the same template of low pay, high turnover, and disregard for the needs of teachers and students. As teachers were wiping noses, working 2 jobs, and getting micromanaged by corporate consultants, our will to fight back was bubbling up under the surface. In West Virginia, a state where public workers have no right to strike, a Facebook group calling for a wildcat strike grew to 73,000 members in only 4 days. West Virginia teachers shut down schools in all 55 counties across the state and forced the right-wing government to walk back damaging cuts and raise salaries. We followed the West Virginia strike closely in Denver, updating each other in the staff office every morning. The success of that West Virginia strike created a domino effect, emboldening teachers hundreds of miles away to stand up against their own poor working conditions. Strikes took off in Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Arizona later that year, sending a message that education workers had reached their breaking point. It's worth noting that this fight back emerged in states that are typically considered conservative or inhospitable to labor activity: West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Arizona. It wasn't the ease of organizing that drove this movement. It was the severity of the conditions. It's also noteworthy that while workers in many sectors of the economy have experienced shrinking wages, poor working conditions, and rising healthcare costs, it was K-12 teachers, 77% of whom are women, whose work has been devalued and demeaned because of its association with caring for children, who rose up. The strike wave was a lesson to us to not underestimate the power of workers organizing ourselves and taking initiative, even when our union's leadership is flat-footed or conservative in pushing for limited demands. So when our next contract negotiation came up in the fall of 2018, Denver teachers were ready. The school district was refusing to budge, doubling down on a failed salary structure which pitted schools and teachers against each other for minimal bonus pay based on test scores. This pay structure was driving turnover and making it impossible for us to live in the city where we work. So in February 2019, we voted to strike, which was a giant leap of faith. We didn't have a strike fund or even a representative in every building. Most of us had never participated in a strike. But in one night, we were able to find a strike captain in each of Denver's 200 plus schools. The night before we were set to strike, the strike captains gathered at our union hall and did a last-minute training on how to walk a picket line. Every day the strike went on, we were told the next day might be the day the line would break, and that masses of teachers would go back to work. The last strike was in 1992, and without any real institutional memory of how to pull it off, the district expected us to fail. Those low expectations were shattered by the creative energy of working people. A small group of young teachers with no formal role in union leadership jumped into organizing, working late into the night every night to plan actions, to write and translate press releases, to contact speakers and plan march routes. Anyone who knows a teacher knows that we are resourceful, and the picket lines were packed with handwritten placards, as well as hundreds of placards donated by the PSL. Before I became an organizer with the PSL, I would have been terrified to talk in front of the whole staff of my school or yell on a bullhorn. My experience as a PSL organizer gave me the confidence and skills to help plan a strike action that thousands of people attended. On February 14th, 2019, Denver Public Schools issued a tentative agreement guaranteeing big raises and an end to performance pay. In 3 days of striking, we were able to undo the damage of a decade of austerity and school reform policies. Of course, no victory is permanent. Just over a year later, we're facing down COVID-related budget cuts that threaten to erase the gains we made in the strike. But what cannot be erased is the fundamental shift in consciousness that came about from our strike. In the middle of the Colorado winter, on a bitterly cold day, our students streamed out of the building and joined us on the picket lines. The Teamsters and postal workers marched beside us, helping to anchor our sometimes shaky pickets. A multinational working class city stood up for our children. We yelled, danced, and played drums. People who were not considered fighters, like women and care workers, became aware of our power and seized it. Looking back on the impact of these strikes on my own life, on the lives of my coworkers, students, and neighbors, I know that workers like us have the power to defeat capitalism, and that when we organize and fight, we win.
Thank you, Maura. Now for our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Shaniqua, a kindergarten and first grade teacher and PSL member. She is joining us from New York City. Welcome, Shaniqua.
The last 6 weeks since the stay-at-home order have been a constant battle between Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio about whether or not schools remain closed and who is responsible for the pending budget cuts. Businesses and schools kept their doors open for much longer than it was healthy for its students and staff, and in essence, the entire city, due to a lack of planning on all levels. As of today, 72 school-based DOE employees, 56 of which were teachers and paraprofessionals, have died. Along with deaths, 15 children aged 2 to 15 have been hospitalized in New York City because they displayed symptoms of a post-immune reaction to COVID-19. The lack of planning on the part of the government not only led to a health crisis, but placed a lot of strain on families and communities that rely on schools in order to get basic necessities met, such as food, mental health and educational services, laundry, and childcare. As businesses began to shut down with fewer people on the trains every day, teachers were told to go to work with no protective gear, just as happened with other workers, and without cleaning supplies. The burden was put on teachers to make sure over 1.1 million students were fed and had a place to go during the pandemic at the expense of our own health. There are over 114,000 homeless children in the New York City public school system. There should have been a plan in place for these children and their families long before schools closed. In fact, these children should have never been homeless in the first place in a country as wealthy as this one. Child care for essential workers should have been accounted for long before the pandemic hit the United States because our work is needed and have always needed it. Countless students have lost access to the services they need in order to not just do their best learning, but to make it through their day-to-day. Many students across the city receive counseling services. They receive speech therapy and occupational services. They receive assistive services and have providers that are there to make sure they can learn and grow. There are students receiving tutoring services or programs to help them prepare for college. Students with disabilities sometimes rely heavily on programs that teach them how to be independent that are only available to them through school. None of this was taken into consideration leading up to the school's closing, and because of it, thousands of students will literally be unable to learn because their needs don't allow them to access the curriculum through remote or distance learning. Many of these resources were already scarce and hard to come by pre-pandemic. With schools closing and no government official capable of enacting a plan that would make sure our students and their communities can thrive, these resources are not just scarce, but completely inaccessible, exacerbating the issues of inequity in New York City public schools. Budget cuts to education will mainly impact schools in poor Black and Latino communities, schools that were already struggling to make ends meet even before the proposed budget cuts. Cuomo asserts that 20% will be cut from the education budget if we do not receive federal aid. In addition to those cuts, Mayor de Blasio also proposed city budget cuts, which will amount to a total of $2 billion in budget cuts over the next 4 years. $100 million of those dollars will be coming out of the Fair Student Funding budget, which helps to cover the amount of money each school can spend per student. In a city where 85% of students are of color and 73% are labeled economically disadvantaged, this is huge. The equity and excellence for all programs, which are central to students' graduation and college enrollment rates, will also be taking a major blow as $54 million is taken away from those programs. Universal pre-K expansion has been cut, as well as a complete overhaul of the Student Youth Employment Program, which provides jobs to 14 to 24-year-olds in New York City. With budget cuts also comes a hiring freeze, leaving positions vacant when teachers and other employees, such as social workers and guidance counselors, retire. We have 3 teachers retiring from my school this year and are scrambling to find a way to fill those positions. The budget cuts proposed by the city and state will only exacerbate the issues faced by the city's 1.1 million students. New York City public school classrooms from 1st grade through 12th have approximately 32 students per class. Increasing class size in overcrowded schools is not an option if we want our students to do their best learning. The inequities students and their families face are already noteworthy, Cutting the budget will push New York City public schools into an even deeper crisis, a crisis we may not be able to bounce back from. Once again, the onus is being placed on teachers to teach through the storm without the support and resources we need. We were forced to work through our contracted spring break and are not being paid for it so that children would stay inside. We were forced to be ready within a week's time to launch new remote learning platforms and resources for students. Right now, chapter leaders are unable to file grievances to the union using the online platform, in essence, being unable to report any contract violations. This crisis is making it an excuse to bypass union rights. Remote learning does not support student growth. It actually deepens inequities among students. Not everyone, including educators, has access to a computer, the internet, or even a space in which they can be productive. It creates further gaps in education where there were already gaps and sets students, especially students living in poverty, students with disabilities, and ESL students up for failure. On top of everything, Cuomo just announced a partnership with the Gates Foundation to reimagine education in this new normal, AKA privatizing education. In order to take care of our students, we need to use the money we have to make mass testing accessible to all and to mobilize the masses to fight for our right to quality healthcare, especially when we are in the middle of a global pandemic. Without mass testing and a public health mobilization, we will not be able to return to school safely, and the youth, especially the Black and Latino youth of this country, will suffer, whether they are students with disabilities or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaniqua. Next, I would like to introduce Frank, a 5th grade bilingual immersion teacher and executive board member of the United Educators of San Francisco. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you, comrade. My name is Frank Lara. I've been an educator for more than 10 years here in San Francisco in the largely Latino district of the Mission. Myself as a union activist, obviously, as a PSL member, we were always told, first thing you want to do is strengthen your union, make it a fighting union. So I got involved very quickly with that and joined the executive committee of my union, 6,000 members, for the last 6 years now. So part of that conversation we've been having in terms of the importance of unions, a lot of it can be generally as the working class. But under capitalism, we know that that capitalism finds a way of dividing us, of separating us through identity, through legacies, through histories. But the truth is that until we understand ourselves as a body, as a union, really as a class, we will not be able to solve the issues under capitalism. So when we talk about the union, we should not also just add that as another identity, as another category within the working class struggle. Because unions, although they express a very important beginning of what working class solidarity, working class unity looks like, in organized working class fighting for the benefit of members in a particular area of work, really what we're talking about is how do we use that as PSL members, as revolutionaries. We have to see how do we show that to inspire the broader community, because we as members, as PSL members, as union members, we don't fit in a bubble. We live under all the conditions, all the things, the children that we serve. I myself as an educator have seen the struggles that our families face. We cannot just deal with the problems of society saying that I myself, under the best circumstance, under my best teaching days, I myself am going to solve the issues of lack of housing, a lack of education, of lack of opportunity. And for me to suddenly say, and all our educators, with a social justice lens, educators who are really trying to push the understanding of how we bring about genuine liberation for our families. When we talk about that, we say the struggle doesn't end in the classroom. It doesn't end when that child comes in with a lot of needs, with a lot of struggles, their family struggles. So when we deal with that in the classroom, we also have to start thinking, how are we going to fight beyond the classroom? Not just in the 8-hour workday when I'm teaching. That is not true liberation. So when we talk about union and community, we have to start breaking that understanding that myself as a union member only fight for my members, only fight for the people in my union, because I know that when I go back to the classroom, my families are struggling, my students are struggling. So what does that look like concretely for our union, particularly our union here in San Francisco, the United Educators of San Francisco, is that we have always stood for housing rights. We have always joined coalitions, nonprofits, or campaigns that have fought for the basic needs of San Francisco families. So one thing most recently, the United Educators of San Francisco started a Pledge Your Stimulus Check campaign for undocumented families. We have raised over $70,000. Educators have paid. We have pledged $120,000, which we're still working to distribute. And that is what we're talking about, real solidarity. The fact that we know as educators, we want to meet those needs. We as a union have fought for privileges for ourselves to maintain a sense of stability, a sense of dignity. But we know that beyond our personal needs, we also have to lift the families, because if not, if we don't all come and rise together, we're going to go back to the same situation that we were faced before. So through that campaign, on top of also politically, our state union, the California Federation of Teachers, have multiple times passed resolutions against the border wall for full rights. Those are things that we then lift each other's voice. And on one level, it's not just a moral thing. It's not just a thing that makes us feel good. But if you think about it, how the ruling class divides us, the antithesis to that is really unifying. Because if the ruling class can then go to a union worker and say, hey, I'm going to pay this other worker who I've not guaranteed any rights, who I actually don't acknowledge exist, who I keep terrorizing, right? And that worker has to then lower their standard of living to subsist under capitalism. Then what continues to happen is that the whole level of living conditions lowers to that point. And then we as union members get told that our privileges are not worth it, that then we get distributed the crumbs, and the ruling class then uses us to divide and conquer. So on another level, on a scientific level, on a tactical level, we have to understand that until we guarantee all working people in the US, all of them, a dignified living, a dignified rights, then we will finally be unified and not allow them to divide, because immigrants want to fight for the rights. We've seen that every time. The only reason why we're seeing a massive upsurge in union organizing, especially at the base, especially in the private sector, is because it's full, all of it, all the memberships are full of immigrants from all types, from first generation, second generation. That is what's pushing the leadership forward, because we have no other alternative but to fight. So when we say how to bring together the unity between community and the union, we have to actively look for opportunities to lend each other a hand. That as union members, when we build privileges, it's not to further consume, it's not to further gain privileges, because at the end of the day, we have seen time and time again that it bottoms out. There is not enough if all of us try to pretend to be capitalist. But the fact that if we start gathering and building our communities together, we can actually, there's enough for all of us to live well. But we have to target the rich, we have to target the wealthy, and that starts by building real, genuine unity in the community and in unions.
Thank you, Frank. Next, we'll hear from Nino, who is speaking to us from Boston, where he is an elementary school teacher and active in the Boston Teachers Union. Nino will be speaking about a new project of the PSL, Reds and Eds. Welcome, Nino.
Peace, how y'all doing? My name is Nino Brown. I'm speaking to you all from Boston. I'm a 5th grade teacher, and I'm a member of Reds and Ed, a new project of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So my last day of school was March 16th, my 29th birthday, and I was glad to spend it with my students. What's happening right now is with the government's response to the coronavirus being really lackluster, we see how this spills out into the education field, where we're told things that education or a public school is the cornerstone of democracy, as a way to say that schools are supposed to be the pillars of our society. But according to the Supreme Court, public education to them is, the most important function of the state and local governments, and that it serves as a foundation of good citizenship and democratic society. So I think it's important that we take a look. Why don't we take a look at these pillars? And there's so-called defenders, right? So the United States Congress, they just passed a $2 trillion assistance package that includes about $13.5 billion for public schools. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, billions of dollars, but two of the largest teachers unions, the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and the National Education Association, the NEA, stated that they would need a minimum of $75 billion in a recent letter to Congress, just for the pandemic relief. So if education or our public schools are supposed to be some cornerstone of democracy, then what does it mean when our Democrats continue to defund it? The pandemic has exposed deepened inequalities in the US capitalist system. Banks and corporations have been bailed out while some districts are already announcing proposed budget cuts and staffing cuts. While advocating for closures, unions also insisted that the schools and districts keep providing resources for families. 51% of public school students, which is over 25 million children, qualify for free and reduced lunch. School districts in multiple states have halted providing food to students, deepening inequities and the crisis. And if we recall, right, when the economy entered into a free fall in 2008, states did nothing to defend teachers, unions, students, and families. Several states had their budgets cut, like Wisconsin, where there was pretty much war over teacher benefits, or states like North Carolina and Florida, where they cut education spending per student from $10,000 to $7,000 in just 3 years, further showing the way that the capitalist government serves as a prop for the ultra-rich. States across the country incentivize students to depart public schools and go to cheaper alternatives, charter schools and voucher programs, as a way to privatize education. But teachers have been fighting back, right? So we saw a waves of strike that Moira spoke to that halted the privatization attacks on public education. And now more than ever, teachers are mobilized. So while we do our work in our classrooms and on our school site and on our sites, we understand that a wider struggle is necessary, that we need to organize society in a way that meets the needs of our students and our families. And if you agree, you should look into Reds in Ed. So I'm also not a history teacher by profession, but I do study history. And in 2008, the capitalist government did the same thing that they're doing now, right? Bailing out the rich and socializing the losses. This has to be some type of great democracy that we live in that does this every time and time again. Obviously not, no, comrades. So these myths peddled as axioms of American culture are collapsing around us, right? Education, as Paulo Freire said, does not change the world in and of itself. It is only the masses, the people, who make change in the world. And that's what Reds in Ed sets out to do. We are teacher activists and socialist organizers from different districts across the United States who are active in our unions and at our sites. And we know our schools and communities have been devastated by decades of cutbacks and anti-union so-called reforms that have left students, schools, and educators under-resourced and under-supported. The incredible struggles waged by teachers from West Virginia to Arizona to Kentucky to California and Illinois over the last few years have built fierce opposition to continued privatization and demanded resources for our schools. It was these teacher strikes that made 2018 and 2019 the year of the strike. So Reds and Eds, we stand in solidarity with all essential workers in healthcare and agriculture, retail, culinary services, distribution, transportation, janitorial, and childcare, and more, who are working to sustain everyone's survival while organizing for safe working conditions. Education workers and their unions have been fighting for students and their families. Many public school parents are themselves essential workers, recognizing the deep connection between learning and working conditions. We are organizing in the midst of a pandemic that has deepened already existing inequalities. Naomi Klein commented on the COVID-19 and how it's affected us. She said that, she's learned a lot of things that we can count on during this time, right? That during moments of cataclysmic change, the previously unthinkable suddenly becomes a reality. So we have two paths and we cannot step back. Our communities are on the line and we as teachers stand in the intersection of so many communities. We have a special role here. We have to be tribunes of the people and commit to a struggle for the common good. If you're interested in learning more about Reds in Ed, you can check out our website and our program at redsined.org. Peace, all power to the people, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Nino. Our final speaker, Natalie Ricci, is a teacher librarian in San Francisco who is active with United Educators of San Francisco, as well as a Central Committee member of the PSL. Please welcome Natalie.
Thank you, everyone. It's really great to be speaking with everyone tonight and to be talking about public education. 6 weeks ago, schools started to close across this country. And as Shaniqua said, they closed too late. Our unions, our educators, those are the people who made the school closures happen in the first place, because we understood what was needed to address the pandemic at a time when the government was doing nothing to address the pandemic. We were worried for our students, our families, ourselves. We were worried about the public health. And so education workers, and when I say education workers, I mean teachers, paraprofessionals, substitutes, cafeteria workers, everyone, janitors, everyone in those buildings that has led the way in pushing flat-footed districts overburdened by administrative costs, and really the consequences of what we've been talking about tonight, of decades of so-called reform that has attacked public education and attacked our unions. The consequences of that is that they couldn't move quick enough to do what was needed. But we did. Educators and families, we came together like we have for many years now to make sure that what was needed to be done was done. And the school building, the buildings that we had to close, have been so much more than buildings. Within those buildings, students have received food, education, mental health services, access to nurses, and critical relationships. And they were never perfect. Inside those buildings, we faced deep inequities that reflected the inequality and oppression that working people and people of color face in the United States. But teachers like ourselves, like the teachers in Reds and Ed and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, socialists have always fought to challenge those inequities within the building itself. But now, in this pandemic, we don't have that building. It was closed because it needed to be. And regardless of those closures, we fought. We fought to make sure food was distributed to our students and our families. We advocated for the distribution of computers, hotspots, work packets. We faced that deep inequality of the digital divide that is now more obvious to everyone than ever before. We figured out how to run classes online. We walked student after student through the minutiae and the challenges, and it hasn't been easy for anyone. It's not easy to get online and try to learn that way from home environments of all different types, both for the educators and the students. Our unions negotiated agreements in districts across the country that established reasonable distance learning expectations, reasonable grading policies, made sure substitutes and paraprofessionals and bus drivers got paid, because districts were trying not to pay some of those workers. Where we still have our social workers and our counselors and our nurses, where they have not been cut, those workers worked double time to reach out to families, to get them what they needed. We even started GoFundMes for our school communities. To say the least, it has been difficult and stressful and incredibly challenging for all education workers. This crisis has shaken the foundations of our work. And now, 6 weeks in, we're being told there is no money for our schools, that our schools and our jobs are on the chopping block. Just last week, 62 superintendents from large public districts like New York, Miami, Los Angeles. These are the administrators, not even the teachers and the paraprofessionals and the cafeteria workers in the communities, but those at the very top. They wrote to Congress. They said they predict 20 to 25% cuts to school revenues. And that means hundreds of thousands of teachers being laid off, because that's always how they solve these issues. They lay off the teachers, they increase the class sizes, they do the exact opposite of what we know is necessary for learning and for public education. But according to them, not just for the pandemic relief, but for the next year, the public schools are going to need over $200 billion. Now, as Nino said, the government in the end of March passed the biggest piece of legislation for relief, and it provided $13 billion for schools, while it funneled billions into the hands of large corporations and banks. And the owners of those large corporations, of those banks, have made huge profits. Jeff Bezos himself was already insanely wealthy, and now is $24 billion richer because of the exploitation during this pandemic, while Amazon and Whole Food workers face situations without healthcare, without proper protective equipment, and insane working conditions. Netflix founder and chief executive Reed Hastings, who has been one of the strongest proponents of the anti-union charter school privatization reform, he himself, not the company, but he himself personally, is now $195 million richer. His personal wealth is over $5 billion. It's absolutely unconscionable that we are in a situation in which the government has taken public money and handed over to the biggest banks and corporations while they're making record profits and the rest of us are suffering. And then day after day for the last week, we've seen news of budget cuts to public education and the public sector, but particularly public education. And we're just supposed to accept the idea that there is no money. It's such a fantastic lie. The federal government has enormous resources. And in the midst of this pandemic, they have the power and they would have popular support to move resources to where they're needed. The budget attacks on public education have to be seen for what they are. They're an extension of a war that was already being waged on public education and on teachers' unions. The pandemic initiated a crisis, but that crisis was due to the utter mismanagement of the US government at the hands of the US ruling class, and it has transformed our reality. Right now, in the last few months of school, a school year that has been unlike any other, heading into summer and not knowing what's to come, states are starting to talk about reopening, about making people go back to work before they've even instituted mass testing, or really mobilize the public health system, which is what is necessary. There's no clear path to reopen schools. Reopening schools will require not decreased personnel, but increased personnel. We need to reduce the number of students in the classroom to maintain physical distancing. There may need to be staggered schedules. There will need to be more paraprofessionals, more teachers, more janitors to clean, more cafeteria workers to safely give out the food that our families depend on. Social workers, counselors, and nurses will all be needed in this to even just address the trauma that our kids have gone through. We'll need hot water. I've been in public schools for 13 years and I've never worked in a school with hot water. It's a basic necessity. So when the needs of the crisis require increased educational funding, and it really, beyond the educational funding, an expansion of social services, when 30 million people have claimed unemployment, you need an expansion of social services. At this moment, the government is announcing huge cuts. They're literally handing over billions to the richest when they continue to fund the war drive. Corporate owners are teaming up with the politicians who are announcing the budget cuts. And with all the attacks on public education, we already know what the answer is. We saw it in the strike wave that a number of my comrades tonight have talked about. From 2018 to 2019, we've shown a bright light on unmaintained buildings, outdated textbooks, cut to services, overworked teachers. That strike wave that started really in Chicago 5 years ago and spread to West Virginia, where it was reinitiated, and Kentucky and Oklahoma and Arizona, then Oakland, Los Angeles, and Chicago again. That stopped the anti-union privatization efforts in their tracks. And those strikes and those worker actions made gains, reversed decades of privatization efforts, increased budgets, made real gains for teachers and students. That transformed the labor movement. It was the year of the strike because teachers, a woman-led labor movement, stepped up. And we made community and teacher organization relationships like we'd never built before. And we are mobilized, and we should continue to be mobilized, because at this moment, there is no choice for us in public education but to struggle. As I said, we should see these budget cuts as an attack on our unions, on ourselves as workers, and on public education as a whole. It is a critical right for our class to be educated. Education is widely recognized as a basic human right, as Nino said. We cannot let them set us up. We cannot let them say there is no money at every single local and district. as they take advantage of this pandemic. And because of them taking advantage of this pandemic, the class struggle is going to intensify, sharpen, as they intensify their war on working people. And our answer has to be to struggle, to come together nationwide, and with our unions, the community connections that we've made, that we've talked about even tonight. And we have to reject the setup. They cannot make us fight local by local, saying there is no money when we know there's money, when they always find the money for the banks and corporations, but they don't find it for people's needs. We know that we, over the last few years, have been at the core with our students, their families, and all education workers, at the core of engaging in a struggle that defended public education, that reversed privatization. And now at this moment, when we're in a moment of a lot of anxiety for many of us, when we're teaching from home in these strange environment, when we're being told, as the New York teachers have, you have to do this, you can't grieve, you have to do all the things they're asking us to do, and then we're gonna put your job on the chopping block. We have to answer that by saying no. We're gonna struggle for public education. We know our role in society. We know our families trust us. We know people stand for public education, and we're gonna use every opportunity right now to build a fight back for public education and understand that it's so necessary to do so. Because when we come together as workers, as families, as students, when we come together, we can win. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, for that presentation. Now we're going to go into our Q&A segment. We have a few questions for our panelists. The first one is for Shaniqua. Shaniqua, we know some like Jeb Bush have called for distance learning to become the new normal. Now, as someone who works with very young students, 5 and 6 years old, you might have a response to that. Is distance learning a substitute for classroom teaching?
Absolutely not. Distance learning is not a substitute at any level of schooling, but it's definitely not a substitute at the kindergarten and first grade level for children who are 5 and 6 years old. At that age, they are very concrete thinkers. They need their curriculum to be hands-on. They need to touch things, they need to feel things. Another aspect of school at that age is socializing. Socializing is like the biggest part of going to kindergarten and learning how to engage with people, how to problem solve, how to negotiate, how to work through difficult moments, and depending on the teacher, like how to organize for things that they need. And so how can you do that through distance learning? You can't. These kids 5 and 6 years old, they can hardly even operate a computer. So, it exacerbates, like I said in my talk, the inequities, in our community, and it doesn't help anyone.
Thank you, Shaniqua. The next question is for Nino. Historically, Reds and Eds, meaning socialists and communists in education, played a major role not only in promoting public education and better conditions for students, but also from the point of view of challenging the dominant narrative on major historical and social issues. For instance, the interpretation of the US Civil War was basically taught from the slave owner's point of view between 1890 and 1935 in public schools. It was the role of socialist teachers, primarily in NYC, but elsewhere, who made the political struggle about learning US history such that the counter-narrative against that of the slave owners finally began to be taught. Does the party's Reds and Eds focus exclusively on trade union issues or thinking broadly in terms of regards to curriculum?
Word, peace. So thank you for that question. Reds and Ed, we are not just fighting for trade union struggles or bread and butter issues. The bread and butter issues are important, that's how we subsist, but we really have to look beyond that. So that's part of the reason why we have a 10-point program. So our 10-point program is to pay all educators living wage, nurses, counselors, social workers, and librarians in every school, limit class size, fully fund our schools, defend our unions, end privatization of public education, prioritize educating our students, not just standardized testing, cops out of school, desegregate education, hire teachers of color, and cancel student loan debt. So these are issues that speak to the entire class, right? These are issues that speak to workers and oppressed people in this country. I mean, I would argue any country, any capitalist country. So we don't just focus on the bread and butter. We see the larger picture that education and public schools exist within a capitalist society that is the major cause, right, of the digital divide, the disparate treatment of Black students and over policing of schools with students of color. So we see the bigger picture. So we definitely don't just fight for trade union issues. And as far as what we can do, or what has already been done in terms of communists and teachers leading the anti-racist struggle within the union, in the labor movement writ large, I think we have that as a benchmark to meet. So the Communist Party in the 30s, they organized the teachers union and linked the struggle against racism to the struggle in the classroom by fighting over right the ruling ideas of society, right? That Reconstruction was not some Black counter-revolution, right? That was the American Revolution, actually. That the community, the larger community of teachers have a direct fight to fight against racism. So not only did the teachers fight to teach, right, people's history, to teach history from the bottom up, what actually happened, they also fought for teachers of color, for Black teachers to be hired so they can teach their own history, right, and tell history from their own points of view. So I think the benchmark is there, and Reds and Ed, we hope to meet it and go past it, because it's really what we need right now.
Thank you, Nino. Finally, Natalie, this last question is for you. Of course, it's difficult to know exactly what will unfold in the next few months, but what would you think are the priorities in building the fight for public education in the coming period amidst deepening class struggle?
I think that's a really critical question, because we know that we are entering an era of really deep class struggle. We understand that the ruling class is taking advantage of this pandemic to really attack the working class in general. I mean, the conditions that workers are being forced to work under in the midst of this pandemic are really just atrocious. And we're seeing the consequences of that. That as they say that hundreds of millions of workers are essential, they don't give them hazard pay or proper protection. And we're gonna face that in public education. And I think we've seen that in public education, the foundation for the struggle we have to wage now has already been built over the last few years. Really what happened in the strike movement, starting all the way in Chicago, is that rank and file teachers who were fed up with what they were facing in the classroom, became union activists and organizers. And they pushed for a different way of fighting. They pushed their unions to stand up and take up strike efforts and organize for strikes, which are not easy efforts. You really have to bring the teachers together, to mobilize, to convince people of the need to put, in some places like in West Virginia, your job on the line. But in places in California where we have the right to strike, it's still your income, the survival of your family, and convince people to take these steps. And we did that because we understood it was the only way to really reverse the conditions of education in the United States after decades and decades of attacks on public education. And I think that's the example for what we need to do now, that our priorities need to be mobilizing. In every place that we're in, those of us who are in education need to fight to make our unions fight. We need to make sure that our unions are standing up for the needs of ourselves and our students and our communities, because when our unions do that, when we come together and we organize, it can be very, very powerful. And I think the first step is that we have to take the reopening of schools very seriously. We have to think about our members who are older, who have issues that make them more susceptible to COVID-19. We need to think about our students and our families and how reopening will happen. But we also have to stop these budget cuts, and we can do it. We can make the argument over and over again that there is money, that the money is there, and that public education should be a priority, not the billionaires and their banks and their corporations. And I think that's the priority for the struggle.
Thank you, Natalie, so much for that response. And I want to thank each of our presenters again for joining our program today and sharing with our viewers. Before we end the webinar, I want to remind people of a couple things. The first being to join us this Saturday, May 9th at 12 noon Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern for a PSL webinar to launch the book Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism, written by Tina Landis with a foreword by Jody Dean. You can purchase a copy of the book today by visiting pslweb.org/store. Also, be sure to follow us on social media at PSL Web and visit Liberation News for daily analysis. And remember, thinking about socialism is good, thinking and talking about socialism is better, but building a revolutionary socialist party is best of all. If you're interested in joining the PSL, you can apply online today at pslweb.org/join. Thank you all for tuning in.